So I thought I would begin with something that I'm going to tell you right from the beginning is bad, but I'm going to tell it anyway. So a dollar bill met up with $100 bill. The dollar bill had not seen the $100 bill in a while and said, "Hey, $100 bill, how are you doing? What you been up to?" The $100 bill said, "Oh, I've been up to a lot. You would not believe it. I've gone on a cruise. I've gone to the casino. I have ate at some of the finest restaurants around the world, and I have just been living it up and having a great time. By the way, what have you been doing?" Well, the dollar bill looked at the $100 bill and said, "Well, same old, church, church, church. That's the only place I go these days." That's horrible, isn't it? It is horrible. But maybe it is an introduction into our second week in talking about finances. Our series is one of our core values at NorthField, and every year we kind of take off on one of our core values, and this happens to be the year for generosity. Rescued people give generously. It hangs on the wall when you come in. We talk about it at starting point. And we acknowledged last week that talking about money and talking about finances can be uncomfortable. However, Jesus, he talked about money and finances more than any other topic he talked about, which is probably one of the ways I will not become like Jesus, because I would have an ulcer if 25% of everything I said was about our stuff. So anyway, I am breaking the barrier at 3 messages this year on this particular topic. For those of you who might be visiting with us today or checking Christianity out, I am so glad that you're here, and I hope that you're not, "Oh man, this is a bad day to come or a bad time to come." And one of the reasons you might think about that is the perception that Christianity has gotten that all churches do is talk about money. And this series may not help a lot with that perception, but I hope that you'll stay with us. And I hope that what you'll discover is really what Jesus is teaching throughout his parables. This series is not really about money, but it's about a heart. He's after our hearts. In the Sermon on the Mount, he made an incredible statement. He said, we're trying to figure out who people are to get down to it. And he said, in the end, this is what I know: where your treasure is, where your money is, where your resources are. Jesus himself says, that's the place I find your heart. So it would behoove us to talk about the very thing that Jesus said is the place I find your heart. The reason Jesus said that is this: nothing will compete more with your commitment to God than your money and your stuff. Nothing will compete more with your commitment to God than your money and your stuff. And the reason it has to be taught is because generosity isn't natural. You know that, don't you? How many of you have children? How many of you have more than one children? More than one child? Maybe that's not even. Okay. Then you know that generosity isn't natural, don't you? You have seen them at play when they were young, and you have seen, what's the favorite word that comes up when there's one truck and 2 boys? Mine, that's right, mine. And sadly, that kind of, maybe not as overt as that, but that attitude seems to come up in adults as well. As we said last week, generous people are consistently generous. We've all heard people say, "I'll be generous when the kids get out of school. I'll be generous when I get the house paid for. I'll be generous when my retirement is done." And we make it a cash flow issue, generosity. And when the cash flows, well, I'll be generous. But here's what we discovered. It isn't poor that makes people generous, nor is it rich that makes people generous. What makes people generous is generous people. People who are generous when they're young, when they're starting out, are generally people who are generous when they're 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old. It would behoove us as parents to instill generosity in our children. And conversely, people who are not generous in their young life are generally people who are not generous as they age. And we discovered that generosity isn't just giving when money is in your pocket. Generosity isn't just giving when you hear a sad story or someone makes a passionate plea. Those things may make you a giver because you can be a giver and not be generous. Generosity actually starts in the heart, and it starts with the way we feel about the stuff that we have. Last week, we began with the first of 3 myths concerning money. Myth number 1 that we looked at concerning money was this: it's all about me. It's all about me. And we looked at Jesus' teaching from the story from Luke 12, specifically the story of the foolish rich man. Rich because he had a lot of stuff. Blessed because more stuff kept coming to him. But foolish because he, somewhere inside of him, began to think that everything that came his way was for him. And as more and more stuff came his way, well, he was American long before there was an American value system out there. As more and more came his way, what he said to himself was, well, I all know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build greater to store the stuff that has come my way. And I'll make life easy. And in the end, his stuff did go to someone else, but not because he was generous, but because he had died. Let me ask you a question. I think it's a fair question. How much more would have to come your way? I'm asking this to me as well. How much more would have to come your way before you decide, I have enough for me? How much more would you have to have? 10,000? 100? 200? Before you would decide, I have enough money, I have enough clothes, I have enough house, I have enough transportation, I have enough stuff. The man in the story was foolish because he thought that if more comes my way, it must be for me. And if you and I don't decide how much is enough, we will consistently be striving and living for newer, shinier, better, more upgraded. And how much more would you and I have to have before we would say, you know what, I have enough? As more comes my way, I will not be thinking of me. I will no longer choose bigger, shinier, and better as more comes my way, but I will seek to serve the kingdom of others, the kingdom of heaven. Because here's the deal. Chances are, if you don't decide what that is for you, there will never be an amount that you would put in there that would work. If you don't decide what enough looks like for you, you will live and spend and ultimately die as though you never had enough, regardless of how much we make. And as tough as life as last week kind of was in delivering, I hope it was received well. Today doesn't get much easier. Today is another challenging message, and it definitely hits home for me. But the second myth we're going to talk about today is this. It's the amount that counts. Myth number 2, it's the amount that counts. And isn't that true in almost every arena of life? That it's the score at the end of the game that counts. It's the grade at the end of the test. It's who made the most baskets. It's the person that scored the most touchdowns. It's the one who crossed the finish line. It's that end thing that counts. But in the area of giving, the big myth is it's the amount that counts. And I would say that you, like me, have heard people say, well, that was such a generous gift. Well, wow, did you see their generosity? And when we hear that word generous, we generally think of generosity in connection with a large gift, don't we? I mean, generally, as people just go, and I know many of you, like me, you do things and you give things, and people don't really see that. Generally, when we speak of someone being generous, well, it's because they gave, well, a big amount with a lot of zeros. But in the end, know this, no one knows if an amount was generous except perhaps 3 people. The person who gave it, God, and their tax accountant, if they have one. Those are about the only April 15th is coming. Anyway, adding zeros to an amount does not necessarily make a gift generous. It just makes a gift large. It might seem like a lot of money that they gave. It might seem like a lot of money to you. It might seem like a lot of money to me. But one of the ways I think that Satan can deceive us into thinking a gift is generous is by looking at the number of zeros behind it, is by looking at the amount. Here's what I would like us to learn today. And in learning this, I hope to be a myth buster because the myth is already on screen. The myth is it's the amount that counts. Let me show you the truth. The truth is this. It's the amount that counts. Now that seems confusing, doesn't it? Maybe it even seems a bit contradictory, but I want you to know as we go through this today, there's a difference in this statement and there's a difference in this statement. And this statement is good news. And the reason this statement is good news is because everyone can be generous and everyone can make generosity a lifestyle. Let me explain what I mean with a story that Jesus told. It made such an impression on his followers that two of the gospel writers talk about it, both Mark and Luke. We're going to look at it from Mark's gospel today. The story occurs during the last week of Jesus' life. The story is such a story of contrast and opposites, and the story concerns offerings of money. In this passage, what we're going to see is that Jesus watches people who are giving. He watches both what they give and he watches how they give. And I wonder in this passage if Jesus is saying, Tom, no one else may know, but you need to know something. God watches what you give, and God watches how you give, Tom. So let's read from Mark chapter 12, 41 through 44, and then we're going to go back and kind of dissect what Jesus is teaching. Verse 41, and he being Jesus, and Jesus sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large, there's our word, amounts. And a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins worth about a penny. And Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Well, as I mentioned, the story takes place during the last week of Jesus' life. It's the week that his death is impending, and the story takes place in the temple in Jerusalem. During the time of Jesus, the temple had been undergoing an 80-year reconstruction. That reconstruction was started by King Herod. Thus, it was known as Herod's Temple. You may have heard of that before. And it was, in its time, one of the largest structures, not only in Jerusalem, but in the entire known world. It's set on a hill that we call Mount Moriah. It was the mount where Solomon's temple had been built years before. It's also the mount where the father of their faith, Abraham, had gone to offer his son Isaac. Its beauty was known all over the world. It stood majestically, not only on top of a little mountain in the city of Jerusalem, but it was 150 foot tall. Herod had taken Solomon's original temple, which was about 17 acres, had expanded it to over 36 acres, and towards the center of the temple complex, just off to the side, was an area known as the Court of the Women. It is where women came and congregated and studied and prayed. And it was also in this kind of courtyard beside the Court of the Women where they kept the offering boxes that Jesus is watching people put money in. If history serves correct, there would have been 13 of these offering boxes, each one of them with a different item or a different thing that the Jewish people could give to. And on top of each of these offering boxes was the place where you dropped your offering. I've got a picture like this. It was shaped much like the end of a trumpet, can you see there? And there would have been 13 of those offering boxes. They were made of brass, and when you put something in it, when you put coins in it, well, it would make a sound that anyone could hear. And the larger the number of coins, well, the greater the sound. Do you remember when we were studying the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus gets to chapter 6 and he begins to talk about giving, and he makes a statement to the people of his day. His statement is this, Matthew 6:2. So when you give to the poor, do not. So when you give to the poor, there would have been a box there marked to the poor. He says, so when you give to the poor, do not announce it with trumpets. Well, a lot of people, you probably would not have seen people getting trumpets and announcing, I'm about to do this. Most people believe what he was talking about were these offering boxes here, because it would have looked like a trumpet. Do not, when you're about to give to the poor, do not go up to the box and throw your stuff in so that everybody will hear and everybody will look. He says, truly, if that's what you want to do, that's what hypocrites do. That's what people who want to make a show of their giving to. And I tell you the truth, if that's the reward they want, that's the only reward they will get. Well, it's in this setting on the temple grounds. It's in this setting just off to the side of the Court of the Women. It's in view of the offering boxes into which Jesus sits down on this occasion, and he begins with these words. And he sat down opposite the treasury, opposite the 13 offering boxes, and he watched. And he watched as people came putting their money into the offering box. And Mark just casually mentions that Jesus notices something. He notices that many rich people were putting in large amounts. In this final week of his life, Jesus sits down in the temple area. His disciples are around him, and he watches as people give. And both Mark and Luke tell us that many rich people were giving lots of money. No doubt they cast their coins noisily into the boxes. No doubt that many of the people watching said, wow, how generous they are. No doubt that other people were listening as the clanging of the offering boxes grew louder and louder. And as everyone is noticing the people who are putting in large amounts of money, as everyone is hearing the clanging of all of these coins and turning their heads and looking, Jesus notices something that no one else notices. Jesus notices, may I say, someone that no one else notices. Verse 42. And a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins worth about a penny. Worth about a penny. If you see Stephanie Harding walking around today, she is wearing one of those coins around her neck today. Some of your versions will say mite. Have you heard of a widow's mite? It is so small, it will almost fit on the end of your fingernail. It weighs practically nothing. Some of your versions will say a lepton. It was the smallest coin used in New Testament times. We might call it a penny, but in actuality, in today's terms, it would be worth about 1/8 of a penny. So if you could divide a penny into 8 parts, it would be worth about 1 of those. And in the middle of what, if you were to go back and you were to read the verses that preceded this, the verses that precede this say that Jesus is watching as the scribes and the Pharisees and the religious teachers are coming into the temple grounds, and he makes some incredible, incriminating statements. He said they devour widows' houses, they pray long prayers, and they wear long flowing robes, making a pretense that their hearts are in the right place. Well, as this is going on in the middle of these rich people giving great amounts of money, and as Jesus says, in the middle of the ones who are desiring the best seats in the synagogue and the best seats in the house, and the ones, showing who they are by the clothing that they wore, with the prayers that went on forever and ever, with the endless clanging of money dropping down these 13 trumpet-shaped boxes, in the middle of all the people who are stopping and glancing and looking at who that might be. All of a sudden, a poor widow, surrounded by the beauty and the opulence of the temple, she comes in and she makes her way across the temple grounds. She makes her way to the court of the women, and she stands in line with all of these people. And one by one, she gets closer and closer to those offering boxes as she approaches one, and she drops in 2 small coins. Coins so small and so weightless that they would not have made a sound. And no one would have noticed the widow. No one would have heard the sound. No one, that is, except Jesus. Well, then Jesus will make a statement that on the surface doesn't seem to be an accurate statement. But it is a statement that reflects how our Heavenly Father views generosity. This is a statement. And Jesus, after seeing this, after witnessing what no one else witnessed, after hearing what no one else heard, Jesus called his disciples, his followers, to him and said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in," say that word with me, "more than all those who are contributing to the offering box." Jesus, who's been teaching in the temple. Jesus, who is going to be asked about taxes in just a little bit. And is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Jesus, who is about to come into the temple and turn over the money changers because they're cheating people. This Jesus looks at his followers, and really he asks them a question. He says, "Did you see what that lady put in? Did you see? Can you see the excitement in his face as he says that? Can you see or hear the excitement in his voice as he said those words? Did you see what that lady put in?" Well, how could they have seen it? There was no fanfare. There was no clanging on the side of the box with her 2 small coins. There was no announcing her offering with a long flowing robe or anything that would have said this lady has given more than all the rest. But because Jesus had a different view of generosity, Jesus saw what no one else saw. So he says, taking the middle part of this verse out, truly, I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all the rest. She has put in more. Well, how can that be in a world of dollars and cents? How could that be more? You see, the only way that statement of Jesus can be true is if what Jesus sees is not, go back to where we started the myth, is if what Jesus sees is not the amount, but the amount in proportion to what you've been given. The amount in proportion to what you've been given. And then Jesus explains how this more than all the others can be true. He says this, for they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Jesus says to the rest, and here is where the convicting part comes in, and here is where I'm going to ask you to trust me, but here is what I'm going to ask you to do, what I have done this week, and is examine your own hearts. Here is where Jesus says to the rest, you gave out of your abundance. You gave after your car was paid for. You gave after your house was built. You gave after your retirement was done. You gave after your boat was in the dock, after your season tickets, after your expensive dinners, after your vacations were done. You gave after you spent what you wanted to spend on the kingdom of you. Then, if there was some left, you gave to the kingdom of others. But she, Jesus says, she sacrificed what she had to live on. Do you realize, this is tough. She gave before the house payment. She gave before the rent. She gave before the electric bill was paid. She gave before, get this, there was food on her table. It is such a scene of contrast. And Jesus says that everyone else made sure that not only what they needed, but what they wanted was taken care of. Then they gave, but she took food out of her mouth and gave. And in the Jesus economy, which is an upside down, crazy kingdom way of doing life, and in no way an earthly way of thinking, because I bet none of us are thinking really good right now. Jesus says, I don't look at the zeros at the end of your check. Nor do I listen to how loud the clanging sounds when you drop your funds into the offering box. Instead, I look at your sacrifice, and all the zeros in the world don't matter to me if what you gave wasn't a sacrifice for you. And I wish that I could stand up here this morning and tell you as your pastor that I understand exactly what Jesus was saying and how all of this plays out. Because I know that there are verses that talk about responsibility, and I know that there are other places in Scripture where you go, and if you don't take care of your family, you're worse than an infidel. There are so many other things there. So let me just say in this, is it okay if the pastor admits that I don't have it all figured out, but maybe I've come to a few things that I want to toss our way today? First of all, admit that I'm challenged by these words. I'm challenged because if I were this lady's financial advisor and she comes to me for advice and she has no husband and she has no job, and in a world where she has no husband would have made her a beggar, and I realize that she has nothing left except these 2 coins, and she tells me that she believes that God is calling her to give those 2 coins to the priest, to the temple, to the church, what would you tell her? Forget what I would tell her for a moment. What would you tell her? Maybe you're different from me, because I think that I would look at her and I would say, honey, like, what are you about to do? Like, God knows this is all you have. I mean, God knows that, you need to eat tomorrow. And last time I looked, God ain't sending manna down from heaven just flying into your, to your window. God will understand that all this stuff, He will understand that you've got rent to pay, a house to put up. So He will understand if you walk away with it in your pocket. In fact, Let me tell you what I would like to do. Could you and I just walk over to that offering box and help me pick it up, and we will pick that thing up and we will turn it over and we will find your 2 mites and we will give them back to you. And not only will we find your 2 mites and give them back to you, but this is what I hope each of us would do. We're going to discover what you need to live on, and we're going to make sure you're taken care of, because that is what God's people are about. And maybe God is saying to us in this story that there are certain groups of people that we need to make sure that we are taking care of. And from the book of Genesis through the book of Revelation, widows and orphans are one of those. And I wonder if Jesus is looking at this crowd and he is saying the very people that you should be taking care of, religious leaders, are the people who are taking care of you. And maybe what Jesus wants us to see, another thing that I've tried to glean from this. Do you realize the depth of trust it would take in God to do what she did? I admit to you, I do not know if my level of trust reaches that. I read that story and I would like to think, oh yeah, well, Tom, you would do the same. But I don't know if I could look at my family and look at this and think, God, and do this. Do you realize the level of trust in God and it challenges me. And the only way, the only way you can practice generosity, the only way to practice it is to do it. It's to be generous. And I'm not saying take everything you have and give it away. I am saying that as a people, that we probably need to start somewhere. And we need to say, you know what, this is a practice that I'm going to start depending on my Heavenly Father more for in the future than I have in the past. I trust Him with my salvation. Why is it when it comes to my money, I want to be careful? Don't go too far. Make sure the people says it makes sense. And maybe Jesus is reminding me, maybe you have to decide for yourself. Maybe He's reminding us rich people that to whom much is given, much will be required. This poor widow in actual amount gave far less than anyone, but in proportion to what she had, gave far more than everyone. And maybe Jesus is saying, you think generous is when the amount is big. I think generous is when the amount is in proportion to what you have been given. Because in the end, the reality is that one person can give $25 in a great act of sacrifice, while another person could give $1 million, and it would be no sacrifice at all. No house bill would go unpaid. No car would go unpurchased, no vacation not taken, no education not funded, no need not met, no want not chosen. As long as I remain a person who gives out of my abundance, then it will require no trust whatsoever in my Heavenly Father. Do you see how much this lady trusted God? David was making atonement for his sins. And the book of Samuel tells us a little bit about that. God told him to go build an altar and to make a sacrifice for his sins. And when he got there, the owner of the property looked at King David and said, hey, you're the king. I'm just going to give you this piece of land. I'm going to give you whatever it takes to make a sacrifice. And in a moment that would help define David as a man after God's own heart, David said these words in 2 Samuel. No, I will not offer the Lord my God a sacrifice that cost me nothing. So, how should we give? As we said last week, I think a more godly way of giving, we often do it like this. We spend it, we save it, we give it. I think a more godly way would be to begin to rethink the way I think about money that comes my way and think others first, then save, then spend. In the book of 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul Apostle Paul writes about this thing of giving, and he says these words, if we want some practical application for today. Now about the collection for the Lord's people, do what I have told the Galatian churches to do. So he writes to the church in Corinth, and he says, this is what I want you to do as a church. And I'm going to tell you the same thing I told the Galatian church. He says this word, on the first day of the week, each of you should set aside a sum of money. Each one of you should set down a church of money. Some of money. He says, Tom, you need a plan. You need a plan. Giving is not waiting until a need comes up and then saying, I'm going to give to that need. Well, giving is that. Generosity is not that. Generosity is pre-deciding in advance that I'm going to set aside a sum of money. Giving is not a wait and see, or generosity is not a wait and see if the pastor shows us some sad pictures. Tom, you need to have an intentional plan, and you need to be specific so that you can, on the first day of the week, set aside a sum of money. So Paul, now that I know what to do, you want me to set aside a sum of money, here comes the natural question. How much money do you want me to set aside? The Apostle Paul says, each one of you should set aside a sum of money, read it with me, in keeping with your income. Do you think he's saying in proportion to what you have been given? How much, Paul? Well, keep in your income. No, Paul, I need an amount. No, Tom, I'm going to say in keeping with your income. No, I need an amount. I want an amount. So what are you saying? I want an amount. No, Tom, in keeping with your income. Well, should it be a percentage? Yeah, I think it should be a percentage, because percentage giving is the only way that story about the widow can be true. Because in dollar and cents, she did not give more. The only way that story could be true is she gave a percentage that was far greater than the percentage that other people were giving. Okay, Paul, one more time. How much? In keeping with your income, Tom. Literally, this means to whatever extent, Tom, that you have prospered, to whatever extent that God has blessed you, to what extent you have been given, Tom, set aside a sum of money. I want to call the band back up because we're going to end singing just 2 songs. Maybe you need to take a baby step today to start somewhere. You're scared, and it can be scary if you're not used to being a giver. And let me say this: if you're not a giver and you are suspect about the church, and you think, well, the church, I don't know that. Give somewhere else. Give somewhere else. I'm not going to tie you to give here. Give somewhere else. I just want you to start the practice of generosity. And you think, well, where do I start? Well, you may think, well, I can't start with 10. 10's like a biblical number. I can't start with 10. We'll start with 2, start with 3, start with 7. 7's a biblical number, but so is 40. 40 days and 40 nights. 40's a biblical number. Start there if you can. Paul says the point is this, Tom, you need to determine what the amount is. And in doing so, you need to decide if you, like the widow, will be a before giver, or if you, like the rest, will be an after giver. The New Testament pattern is giving in such a way that truly demonstrates what God has given me. I've always been challenged by the writings of C.S. Lewis. Perhaps many of you have as well. In his book, Mere Christianity, he wrote these words: I do not believe that one can settle how much we ought to give. I'm afraid that the only safe rule is to give more than you think you can. In other words, if our expenditures on our own comforts, our own luxuries, our own amusements is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, we probably are giving away too little. If our charitable giving does not at all pinch or hamper us in any way, I should say that they are too small. There ought to be things we would like to do, but do not do, because our charitable giving excludes them. So maybe the questions remain. To what extent have you been given grace by your Heavenly Father? That as you have freely been given, freely give. To what extent have you experienced forgiveness? To what extent have you been given life? Well, to the extent you have freely received, freely give. We're about to sing what he's done. And maybe the secret to being generous is to constantly have at the front of my mind what he's done. And to the extent that he has freely given to me, well, then to that extent, I should freely give to others heart, soul, mind, and strength. Maybe the question in the end is the right question. How much more would you have to have before you would ever say, I have enough?